Well, good morning again. Good to be back. Obviously, we're going to continue to pray for, hopefully do, pray for your pastor that he would be healed and be able to continue on with his calling. And we're going to continue in the book of Hebrews, finishing up chapter 12. As I said the other day, there's only 13 chapters, although I guess the way I've been teaching through it, it feels like it's going to go on forever. But that's okay. The longer we spend in God's Word, the better. And the better we understand it, the better we are. So if you've gone back and watched some from the last few times before when I was here, Paul goes through and does a lot of comparing and contrasting of the Jewish life as a whole, the Jewish mindset, philosophy, theology, however you want to phrase that, in comparison to Christ and what Christ brings to the table with a better understanding of the law, better understanding of salvation. And really, that sums up what God was doing in the Old Testament. So we go through the Old Testament and have all the Old Testament heroes who were all types of Christ. They all shared some good aspect of Christ. If you put them all together, you have Christ. But obviously, they're not the Messiah, otherwise we wouldn't need Jesus. So Paul's gotten into that earlier in Hebrews. But he's bringing it to a close. Actually, there's one chapter left. But as we pick up in Hebrews chapter 12, starting at verse 18, he's going to make a very interesting comparison that would definitely be easy for the Jews to understand. Like I said, picking up here, Hebrews chapter 12, verse 18. For you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest, the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them. Verse 20, for they could not endure the order that was given. Even if a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this day, this opportunity, freedom today, dear Lord, that would help us to further your kingdom. We ask for all this in Jesus' precious name. So the comparison that he's getting into is Moses going up to Mount Sinai, back in Exodus. And what we're going to get into later on in the rest of this chapter is a comparison between Mount Sinai and Mount Zion. Now, Mount Zion is in Jerusalem. That's where the temple will be built. That's where the Christ's throne will be eventually. And so he's comparing and contrasting the Old Testament to the New, really. The Old Covenant under God that was given to the Israelites at Mount Sinai compared to the New Covenant under Christ. And what you have under the Old Covenant with the Jews originally, and this is where a lot of people want to try and argue against the faith or say they can't understand or handle why God would be like this, but he's this vengeful, big, mean sky daddy that just wants to beat you all the time. And that's the way a lot of people try to look at this, because they quite frankly don't want to accept the whole thing because they don't want to admit to their own sins. But the comparison there is Old Testament God was very hands-on in disciplining the Jews. And every time they would transgress the law, they would go chasing after false idols. And every time they get in trouble, what he'd do, he'd turn them over to, he would raise up a powerful pagan nation that would come in and discipline them until the whole nation of Israel would get to a point where they cried out and they were willing to submit themselves back to God. And so then he would raise up a judge or a prophet or somebody to go in and defeat their enemies. And of course, that's after Mount Sinai. But in order to, like I said, keep this in mind, when Moses went up to Mount Sinai, they had just left Egypt, and they still had the thought processes in the presence of the pagan false gods that Egypt had. Sound. They had to wait for the Canaanites to mature in their sin for them to be able to enter in and run them out. God ran them out and defeat them within the land of Canaan. That's one of the reasons why they were in Egypt for 400 years. And then they spent 40 years in the desert because they refused to have enough faith to enter into the promised land to trust God for the whole process. So, to give them the initial law to bring them out of the idolatry, to bring them out of the false worship and the pagan worship, the law was given to Moses, the 10 Commandments, as we know, on Mount Sinai. And to be in the presence of God himself was a fearful thing, and that it made everybody tremble. Moses himself even trembled, even though he was the man called to represent God. But when you actually sit down and study the law, it does kind of comes across as a lot of do's and don'ts, and especially if you don't do this, then you die. I mean, think about when the priests would enter the temple once a year for the Holy of Holies for the annual sacrifice. That would, cleanse the whole out by a rope and line up another priest to go in and hopefully get that right. And God, and that's exactly, brother, that's exactly what Paul is hitting on here at the end of chapter 12. You go before God in the Old Testament with fear and trembling. They went to Mount Sinai with fear and trembling. The sound of God's voice rumbling through. It's, when you read the encounters with God, even Moses on Mount Sinai, God had to turn his back to him so that his full glory and his full radiance wouldn't kill Moses on Mount Sinai. And when Moses would come down from Mount Sinai, he had to wear a veil because to God. And they were fearful of that power. And so when God spoke, things shake and things tremble and things move. When Paul encountered Christ on the road to Damascus, he struck him blind and he passed out. And he was blind for 3 days. Came into the presence of God. But when Christ comes as a babe laid in a manger. And I know there's some issues, and it's pretty interesting because now it's into season 4, and it's leading up to, matter of fact, they just did the second episode of the season 4 of The Chosen. If you haven't watched that, check it out. It's really the closest thing to what the Jews called midrash. And it was a parable way of telling stories. And so it's an interpretation of the Bible. There's a lot of room to fill in things, so they do take a little bit of artistic license. Christ closer. And whether you agree with it or not, that's fine. If you don't want to watch it, that's fine too. Even if you don't agree with it. It's interesting to go and study and say, what are they doing here? What are they saying here? Is that really accurate? But it does bring home the idea that Christ was personal. We're 2,000 years removed, so it's a little harder for us to kind of grasp that God was in the flesh on earth. And even without a TV show, if we read our Bibles properly, if we read the New Testament and get into the Gospels, he wept at the passing of Lazarus. It's first episode of season 4 on The Chosen, they dealt with the beheading of John the Baptist, Christ's cousin, somebody he would have grown up with. I can imagine that would have made him sad. There was a time of mourning. So Christ is yes, he's God, but he's God in the flesh, and it's the discipline came, and now it's time to treat a child. When you discipline a child, and you have to go back after the discipline is done, doing what he did in the Old Testament because he hated us. He wanted to bring people out of their sin and wanted them to obey. And so That's the difference between Mount Sinai and Mount Zion. And you and I, thankfully, especially being Gentiles, we have access to Mount Zion because of Christ. So instead of trembling with fear, and it's not that we need to not fear God, but we should know that we can go to Christ. Just as a child should know, even though they've been disciplined, they should know that they can go to their father or their mother, whoever, and go to that authority figure and admit when they're wrong and be corrected and be loved. All right, so Hebrews 12, chapter 12, verse 22. But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. Old Testament, you had to go before a priest. Priest had to go before God. A lot of ritual, a lot of different things that had to be done, but they had to keep being done over and over and over again. And so that's old covenant. That's Old Testament. New Testament, Christ, as has been explained already in Hebrews, is the only mediator we need between God and man. An eternal sacrifice who's an eternal mediator who's able to stand before an eternal God and say, these are my children. They are covered by my blood. That makes them righteous and perfect to be able to go before you, God, and worship you. And it's going back to the book of Genesis, talking about the blood of Abel, whose blood was shed on the ground. That cried for vengeance. That blood cried for discipline. Blood of Christ, blood of the Lamb sprinkled on the doorpost, the blood of the Lamb sprinkled within the temple to sanctify and purify. That blood cries forgiveness. That blood says it is done. So God will have his, justice will be served, justice will be done. But again, the blood of the Lamb is a much greater, better sound that cries out to us, that cries out to God than the blood of Abel. So verse 25, see that you do not refuse him who is speaking. Paul's not talking about himself there. For if they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, much less will we escape if we reject him who warns from heaven. At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. That's quoting Haggai chapter 2, verse 21, Old Testament prophet. But see that you do not refuse him who is speaking, right? And was it Lazarus and the poor man, the rich man and the poor man, and the rich man is in Sheol, on the bad side of Sheol, and he's crying out to Jesus, and he says, hey, let me go back and tell my brothers if this is all real. Let me go back and tell my brothers that there is hell, essentially, is what he's talking about. Let me go back, and Christ says to him, hey, if they didn't believe me, what makes you think they're going to believe you? And don't let anybody fool you or try to tell you that everybody gets to go to heaven, because they don't. Like I just said a few minutes ago, those who are covered by the blood of Christ are the only ones that can go before. God doesn't send anybody to hell, but he gives you the choice. You can choose him and go to heaven, or you can not choose him and send yourself to hell. Anybody who tries to tell you any different is looking for some sort of way to shift the blame and to deny things, just like they did back in the garden. But he's going to shake the heavens. It's when he hung the stars and when he hung the planets and when he created the universe, it's God who holds it all in place. Like I said, they found out on a microscopic level that the atoms, the nucleus and the electrons and the protons and all that make up these little tiny particles that make up atoms, that make up elements, and eventually make up us, move in the shape of a cross. And so there's evidence on that microscopic level that God holds it all together. And when he decides that it's time, go forward and read Revelation, go back and read the book of Daniel, he's going to shake the heavens. The earth shook when Christ died on the cross. And when God would speak in the Old Testament, thunder and lightning, and the mountains shook. But there will come a time when he's going to shake all things that are made to the point where they will go away, only to be replaced by what cannot be shaken. But verse 27, the phrase, yet once more, indicates the removal of things that are shaken, that is, things that have been made, in order that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. When you and I accept Christ, we become members, we become subject of a kingdom that cannot be shaken. An eternal kingdom. Everything on earth is temporary. Everything we're doing here is temporary. It may have eternal consequences. But this building, as much as I love this wood and stuff in here and the workmanship that was put into this building, it will be shaken. It will fall one day and it will be destroyed. And the earth is purified by fire. So he shook the earth and he purified it by water in the Old Testament. Promised he would never do that again. Gave us the rainbow. God gave us the rainbow, not man, not perverts. But he did that then, and he promised he would do it again. So what's the next way to purify something? By fire. God uses fire to cleanse things. When you burn something, it changes. And if you were to take your gold jewelry and you melt it down to make a new piece of jewelry, or if you have scraps of gold, scraps of whatever metal, and you melt it all down, there's particles that actually come to the top of that called dross. That dross is impurities in the metal. The hotter it is, the longer you burn it, the longer you keep it hot, the more those impurities raise to the top and you can take them away, the more the impurities burn away themselves. And so what you're left with is pure. Okay? And we think about gold, and we have 24 karat, 14 karat, that sort of thing. But gold in and of itself, the purest we can get at 24 karat, compared to, go look in the book of Revelation, chapter 21. The gold that God makes in heaven, that the city of New Jerusalem will be made from, is so pure that light can shine through it. Read Revelation chapter 21. Sit down and read it. The description of New Jerusalem, and that's one of my favorite passages, not because I'm greedy, but because of God's Son. We have stars. We have things in the night for us to be able to see. All that, when he shakes things again, all that will fall away. Because those are the things made. That's what Paul's talking about here. So when A heavenly kingdom that cannot be shaken comes down. If you think you can have a beautiful house today, you ain't seen nothing yet. That's probably my stuff coming. But at the end of that, coming down to Mount Zion, you ain't seen nothing yet. The beauty, the purity, the sanctity of it, the righteousness of it, God himself is greater than even that. He himself will be in the middle of it. But again, for his light to radiate the universe, where we don't need a sun and we don't need the stars, that gold has to be so pure that his light will shine through it. If that doesn't blow your mind, either I'm not saying it right or you're just not listening. To me, the work through people like me and through people like you, through us, who even try. There's no way that I can do anything without his help. I do nothing on my own. Can't preach on my own. I could, but it would go nowhere. Eternity in heaven together. And when this is being written, one of the things going on, again, go into Corinthians and some of the other letters, the Judaizers were running around there, and you see them today. There's people today, modern day Judaizers, who will tell you that you have to do what the law says. And if they couldn't do it, what makes you think you can do it? I mean, let's apply some logic here. Faith is wonderful, and faith is a good thing and necessary, but faith is not blind. And our faith in God is not assumption. It's not an imaginary thing. It is not something to just sit there and say, we can know God. We can see him in his creation, and we can read him in his word. And we can respond to the Holy Spirit. And what Paul is going to say here is, what he is saying is, don't fall back. He's telling the Hebrews at that time, accept Christ and don't fall back into the old ways that you were used to, that you were doing under the old covenant. He's not saying don't be ashamed. We're telling you. And today, same thing applies today, because there are religious leaders in the world who are telling you that you, pick on the Roman Catholics again, heard a comedian say this, and they were talking about growing up in the Catholic faith, and he was in Catholic school, and he was told point blank, before you ever approach Jesus, you better go through Saint so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so. So we don't need to fall into the trap of idolatry. We don't need to fall into the trap of vain religion. As I've said before, I have no problem with religion. I wish people were more religious about reading their Bibles and going to church and Sunday school and evangelizing and all that sort of stuff. Church would be in much better shape, certainly here in North America, if we were to be more religious about things, because we've fallen into the trap of easy believism that you don't have to do anything. Just show up to church every once in a while, sing a few hymns, throw a few dollars on the plate, you're good. It's our faith is an act of faith. What he calls us to do. That's why he set it up. And that's all he asks. And when you stop and think about, faith can move a mountain, God's not telling you for you to move that mountain. He's saying have faith in him, because he's the one that can move the mountain. So don't fall back into the traps of the Old Testament and the old way of doing things and the old religions, where everything was just so structured that there was no truly worship. Now, how many songs you sing, and One of the songs that you had up on the screen, Miss Connie, it's done by a group of folks who did some good songs, but their church has gone off the rails so far it's not even funny. They're not even a Christian church anymore. Their worship is not acceptable to God because it doesn't honor Him. Sounds like it does. A lot of people sound like they do. But not all worship is acceptable. And it's true worship is going to come from the heart, and true worship is going to honor and glorify God. It's not going to honor and glorify yourself. In case you're wondering, how would you know? But He's a God that is a consuming fire. If you let God consume the sin and everything inside you in that fire to purify you and to sanctify you, crowns in heaven. And that's referencing Daniel chapter 2, verse 44. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces. All these kingdoms, it shall break in temporary. And you want to get into Daniel's prophecies. He had the statue with all the different materials that represented different nations and different periods. And they all have fallen, they all have crumbled. The gold, the bronze, the stone and the clay, the metal and the sand, and just all of that, God will shake and bring to an end, but His kingdom will stand forever. And what you and I do, we do for the kingdom. We do for eternity. So are you a mentor? Study the Word. Seek out your salvation with fear and trembling. Yeah,